The rain had just stopped when David Cole pulled into his driveway. He stepped out of his car, briefcase in hand, already tired from another long day at the office. He wanted nothing more than to sit inside his quiet home, make himself a cup of coffee, and enjoy a few moments of peace. But taped to his front door was a bright yellow paper, bold letters screaming, "Notice of violation." David tore it down and read quickly. According to the notice, he had violated the Homeowners Association rules by parking his truck in the driveway overnight. He frowned, shaking his head in disbelief. His truck wasn't oversized, it wasn't blocking the street, and his driveway was his property. But the HOA seemed to think otherwise. The letter demanded that he stop parking there immediately or face a $100 fine for every night of noncompliance. This wasn't the first notice he had received. In fact, over the past few months, the HOA had become a constant presence in his life. A warning about the color of his trash bins, another about the length of his grass, even a complaint about the small birdhouse his daughter had painted and placed in the front yard. Each time, David felt more suffocated by rules that seemed less about keeping the neighborhood tidy and more about control. Inside, his wife Laura noticed his scowl as he tossed the notice on the kitchen counter. "Another one?" she asked softly, already knowing the answer. "They're saying I can't park in my own driveway now," David muttered, running a hand through his hair. "This is insane. I pay my dues every month, I maintain the house, and they're telling me where I can or can't park." Laura sighed. "Maybe you should just move the truck, I don't want trouble with them." "That's the problem," David snapped, then caught himself and lowered his voice. "If I move it now, what's next? They'll find something else, they always do." For days, the notices continued. The HOA president, a sharp-tongued man named Richard Hale, seemed especially eager to target David. Neighbors whispered that Richard had a personal dislike for him, perhaps because David had once questioned a budget increase at a community meeting, embarrassing Richard in front of everyone. Whatever the reason, the violations kept piling up. David began attending the HOA meetings, determined to understand what was happening. The meetings were held once a month in the community clubhouse, a sterile room with white walls and fluorescent lighting that buzzed overhead. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows, though few residents actually showed up. Most people either didn't care enough or were too intimidated to challenge the board. On his first night attending, David sat quietly in the back, listening. Richard, dressed in a neatly pressed shirt and tie, sat at the front with 3 other board members, rattling off new policies and fines. It felt less like a community discussion and more like a lecture. When the time came for residents to speak, David raised his hand. "I'd like to address the parking issue," he said, standing. His voice was calm, though inside his chest his heart was pounding. "The HOA has been fining me for parking my truck in my driveway. I've read the bylaws and there's nothing in there that prohibits it. Can you explain why I'm being penalized?" Richard didn't even look surprised. He leaned back in his chair, smirking slightly. "The board has the authority to make decisions in the best interest of the neighborhood," he replied smoothly. "We've determined that large trucks in driveways affect property values." "My truck isn't large," David countered. "It's a standard pickup, and I have every right to park in my own driveway." Richard's smirk vanished, replaced by a thin-lipped frown. "The board's decision stands. If you have a problem, you can file an appeal in writing." Murmurs rippled through the few neighbors in attendance. Some avoided eye contact while others looked at David with sympathy, but no one spoke up. That night David lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The injustice gnawed at him. He had always believed in playing by the rules, but what do you do when the rules are bent against you? He thought of his daughter's birdhouse, painted in bright colors and now tucked away in the garage because the HOA had deemed it unsightly. He thought of the money they were demanding in fines, money that could go to his family instead of feeding the board's obsession with control. Something in him hardened. He wasn't going to roll over. He wasn't going to let Richard and his board bully him into submission. He decided then and there he would fight back. The next morning, David began his research. He pored over the HOA bylaws, reading every line carefully. He highlighted sections, took notes, and discovered several inconsistencies. The bylaws were vague, full of loopholes that the board seemed to exploit whenever convenient. He also learned that the HOA was legally required to follow its own rules and state regulations, a fact Richard seemed to conveniently ignore. As days turned into weeks, David collected everything. Copies of the violation notices, photos of his truck in the driveway, and even testimonies from neighbors who parked similar vehicles without receiving fines. He found residents who had been fined for ridiculous reasons, like leaving a garden hose visible or planting flowers outside the approved color scheme. The more he learned, the angrier he became. This wasn't just about his driveway anymore. It was about power, about a board that acted like kings ruling over a neighborhood, and it was about neighbors who were too scared or too weary to resist. Laura noticed the growing stack of papers on his desk. "Are you sure this is worth it?" she asked one night. David looked at her with determination in his eyes. "It's more than worth it. If I don't fight back, they'll just keep doing this to us and to everyone else. Somebody has to stand up to them." He filed his appeal in writing, just as Richard had instructed, though he knew it would likely be ignored. At the next HOA meeting, he came armed with documents and photographs. This time, when Richard tried to brush him off, David didn't back down. He presented his evidence calmly but firmly, pointing out how the bylaws didn't support the fines, how other residents weren't being treated the same way, how the board was abusing its authority. The tension in the room was thick. Neighbors shifted in their seats, listening more intently than before. For the first time, someone was challenging the board openly and with proof. Richard's face flushed red as David spoke, his usual calm demeanor cracking under the pressure. By the time the meeting ended, no resolution had been reached, but David had made his point clear. He wasn't going away quietly. As he walked home that night, a few neighbors approached him quietly. "Good job," one whispered. "I've been fined too for stupid things. I just paid because I didn't want trouble." "Keep at it," another said. "You're saying what we've all been thinking." David realized then that this fight was bigger than just him. He was becoming a voice for everyone who had been pushed around by the HOA, and deep down he knew Richard wouldn't take this challenge lightly. But neither would he. The following weeks brought a storm that had nothing to do with the weather. The HOA board, led by Richard Hale, doubled down on its campaign against David. Notices came faster, fines grew larger, and the tone of each letter became increasingly hostile. They claimed his lawn was not up to community standards, even though he mowed it twice a week. They said his mailbox needed repainting despite its fresh coat of white paint. It was obvious they were targeting him specifically. David, however, refused to be intimidated. He documented everything, keeping a neatly organized folder with each letter, photo, and date. He had started reading articles and legal blogs about HOA abuse and was surprised to learn how common it was across the country. Some boards, he discovered, thrived on pushing homeowners around because most people either lacked the knowledge or the will to resist. Determined not to fight alone, David began talking to neighbors more openly. One Saturday afternoon, he invited a few families over for a barbecue. At first, the conversation was casual, but soon it turned to the topic everyone had been avoiding. "They fined me for having my kids' bikes on the front porch," said Martha, a mother of 3 who lived 2 houses down. "They told me my shutters weren't the right shade of green," added Tom, a retired veteran. "I had to repaint them twice, cost me nearly $1,000. "And don't get me started on the pool rules," another neighbor groaned. "We pay for that pool with our dues, yet they make it impossible to use." The more stories David heard, the clearer the pattern became. This wasn't about keeping the neighborhood beautiful. It was about control and money, and Richard Hale was at the center of it. "We need to do something," David said firmly, looking around the group. "If we keep paying fines and staying quiet, they'll just keep tightening their grip, but if we stand together, they can't ignore us." The neighbors exchanged hesitant glances. Years of intimidation had made them cautious, but David's resolve was contagious. Slowly, heads began to nod. That evening, David drafted a petition. The document demanded transparency from the HOA, including a full accounting of how dues were being spent, and called for a review of all recent fines. Over the next 2 weeks, he went door to door, speaking with residents, explaining their rights and asking for signatures. Some slammed the door, unwilling to get involved, but many others, tired of living under constant scrutiny, signed eagerly. By the end of the month, David had over 40 signatures, more than half the neighborhood. Armed with the petition, he attended the next HOA meeting. When he walked into the clubhouse, the air was electric. More residents had shown up than ever before, many clutching copies of the petition. Richard sat at the front, visibly unsettled by the unexpected turnout. David stood and addressed the room. "We, the residents of this community, demand accountability. We demand that the board explain how our money is being used, why fines are being handed out unfairly, and why decisions are being made without proper input." He held up the petition for all to see. "This is signed by the majority of homeowners here. We will no longer be silenced." The room erupted in murmurs and nods of agreement. For the first time, Richard's usual confident smirk faltered. He tried to regain control. "These meetings are not the place for mob rule," he snapped. The board has full authority. No, David interrupted, his voice steady. The board serves the community, not the other way around. Several residents clapped. Richard's face turned crimson, but he couldn't shout them all down. After that night, the battle escalated. The HOA tried intimidation tactics, threatening lawsuits against David and even attempting to place a lien on his property for unpaid fines. But David had anticipated this. He had already contacted a lawyer specializing in HOA disputes. The lawyer, impressed by the meticulous records David had kept, assured him they had a strong case. News of the fight spread quickly. Local media picked up the story, framing it as a classic battle of one resident standing up against a powerful HOA. Reporters showed up at meetings, cameras capturing the heated exchanges. Suddenly, Richard and his board were under public scrutiny, something they clearly despised. Neighbors who had once stayed silent now began speaking out. At meetings, more voices joined David's, recounting stories of unjust fines and heavy-handed enforcement. The board's authority, once unquestioned, now seemed fragile. Richard tried every trick in the book. He sent threatening letters, called emergency meetings without notice, and even tried to smear David's reputation by spreading rumors. But each move backfired. The more the board pushed, the more the community rallied behind David. One evening, after yet another tense meeting, David returned home exhausted but resolute. Laura hugged him tightly. "You're really shaking things up," she whispered. "Good," he replied, holding her close, "because this is our home, and I'll be damned if I let them bully us out of it." Behind closed doors, however, Richard and the board were plotting their next move. They weren't going to let David's rebellion continue unchecked. What David didn't yet know was that the climax of this battle was still ahead, one that would test not only his resolve but the entire neighborhood's unity. The summer heat weighed heavily over the neighborhood, but the tension between the homeowners and the board was hotter still. Every time David stepped outside, he felt eyes watching him, neighbors peeking through blinds, board members driving by slowly as if to remind him he was under surveillance. Still, he refused to give an inch. The board's most aggressive move came in the form of a certified letter delivered one Tuesday afternoon. David tore it open at the kitchen counter as Laura looked on anxiously. Inside was a notice of intent to foreclose on their home. The board claimed David owed thousands of dollars in unpaid fines and legal fees. If he didn't pay, they would move forward with seizing his house. For a moment, David felt his knees weaken. The audacity of it stunned him. They were really trying to take his home, all because he had dared to stand up to them. Laura's voice trembled. "David, what are we going to do?" He straightened, the paper crumpling in his fist. "We fight harder." The very next morning, David and his lawyer filed a lawsuit against the HOA. The claim accused the board of harassment, selective enforcement, and misuse of funds. They requested a full audit of the HOA's finances, confident that the books would reveal shady dealings. When news of the lawsuit broke, the community buzzed with excitement. Many residents, emboldened by David's courage, came forward with their own evidence. A retired accountant volunteered to help review the financial statements, and what they found shocked everyone. Thousands of dollars in administrative expenses with no receipts, inflated legal fees, and even payments to companies linked directly to Richard's relatives. At the next meeting, David's lawyer accompanied him. The clubhouse was packed, every chair taken, people lining the walls, reporters setting up cameras. Richard looked rattled, sweat glistening on his forehead. David rose to speak, his voice carried across the silent room. "We entrusted this board with our money, our community, our peace of mind. Instead, you've used that power to harass, intimidate, and enrich yourselves. We have the proof, and now the law will hold you accountable." He handed the financial documents to the lawyer, who placed them on the table before the board members. The crowd gasped as the details were read aloud: unauthorized payments, unexplained withdrawals, blatant conflicts of interest. Richard tried to interrupt, shouting that the documents were taken out of context. But his voice was drowned by angry residents demanding answers. The calm facade he had maintained for years cracked wide open. He slammed his fist on the table, yelling that the board's authority was absolute. That was his mistake. "You're wrong," David said firmly, stepping closer. "The authority belongs to the homeowners, the people sitting in this room, and we are done letting you abuse it." Cheers erupted. The room was no longer Richard's to control. One by one, residents stood and voiced their support for removing the entire board. A vote was called on the spot, and with overwhelming majority, Richard and his allies were ousted. The new board, formed from residents who had once been silent, promised transparency and accountability. In the weeks that followed, the community changed. The threatening notices stopped. The birdhouse his daughter painted was placed back in the yard where it belonged. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now greeted David warmly, grateful that he had dared to stand up. The legal case dragged on, but the evidence was damning. Richard eventually resigned in disgrace, facing not only the loss of his position but potential criminal charges for financial misconduct. The neighborhood he had ruled with an iron fist was finally free of his control. On a quiet evening not long after, David sat on his porch watching the sun dip below the horizon. His truck was parked proudly in the driveway, a simple symbol of the fight he had won. Laura brought him a glass of iced tea and sat beside him. "You did it," she said softly. "We did it," he corrected, glancing at her with a smile. "All of us. This isn't just my victory, it's the whole neighborhood." He looked out across the rows of houses, children playing on lawns, families chatting on porches, and felt a deep sense of pride. The HOA had tried to break him, but instead it had awakened a spirit of unity in the community. It hadn't been easy. The stress, the fear, the endless nights of planning and preparing, those scars would remain. But he had learned something invaluable. Power only lasts when people allow it, and when one person dares to resist, others find the courage to stand with them. For the first time in a long while, David felt at peace. His home truly felt like his again. Not just the walls and roof he had bought with his savings, but the neighborhood, the sense of belonging, the right to live freely without being bullied by those who sought control. As the evening air cooled, he leaned back in his chair, content. The battle was over and they had won. And from that victory, a lesson remained, one he knew his neighbors would never forget. When residents fight back, even the most powerful HOA cannot stand forever.